My friends, let me begin with a simple question. What happens when the truth finally breaks through the walls of illusion, the slogans, and the theatrics? That's when people in power, particularly those who have built their entire persona on bluster and dominance, begin to unravel. And yes, Mr. Trump will melt down when he realizes this one unavoidable fact. The anger and frustration of the American people is no longer just about one man or one party. It is about a failing system. You see, for decades, we've been told that if we just cut taxes for the rich, deregulate corporations, and hand more power to Wall Street, prosperity will trickle down to the rest of us. We were told to trust billionaires, to see them as job creators, to idolize them. Mr. Trump rode that story like a wave. He branded himself as the ultimate businessman, the man who understood money and power. But here's the truth that will shake him, the truth he cannot spin. The majority of Americans now understand that this economic system does not work for them. They see their wages stagnate while prices rise. They see their children saddled with debt, their health care tied to jobs that are disappearing, their futures slipping away. That's not the story of one man. It's the failure of capitalism as it is practiced here in the United States. And here's the hook. When Mr. Trump realizes that his followers are not just angry at Democrats or liberals, but are waking up to the fact that their suffering comes from an entire economic system that both parties have protected, that's when the meltdown begins. Because then his role as the savior businessman collapses. Then the mask falls. Then it's not about him anymore, but about the structure of an economy that enriches the top 1% at the expense of everyone else. Mr. Trump will not know how to handle this. His instinct will be to deflect, to distract, to attack, but rage cannot paper over reality. The working people of this country are beginning to connect the dots. The jobs that disappeared weren't stolen by immigrants. They were outsourced by corporations. The factories that closed weren't the fault of foreign competitors. They were shut down by executives chasing higher profits, and the wealth that was extracted from our communities wasn't redistributed fairly. It was hoarded at the top. That truth will melt down not just Mr. Trump, but the entire illusion that billionaires are here to save us. Donald Trump has long built his political persona around the image of a successful businessman, a master negotiator, and someone who understands money and power in ways that ordinary politicians never could. It was this carefully constructed identity that allowed him to present himself as an outsider capable of fixing Washington, draining the swamp, and bringing back prosperity to everyday Americans. But when that image collides with the growing awareness among Americans that their economic problems are not the result of one man's mismanagement, but of a deeply flawed economic system, the foundations of Trump's persona begin to crumble. The very identity that carried him into the White House becomes a liability once people recognize that the so-called businessman cannot offer solutions to problems rooted in systemic failure. For decades, the narrative of the businessman turned savior has been nurtured in American culture. Success in the private sector, particularly in real estate, finance, or technology, was framed as proof of competence and leadership. The idea was simple. If someone can make money, they must know how to create jobs, manage resources, and solve problems efficiently. Trump capitalized on this narrative more aggressively than most, selling himself through television, branding, and relentless self-promotion as the epitome of business acumen. He claimed that his experience in negotiating deals, building towers, and cultivating a global brand would translate directly into political leadership. To millions of voters frustrated with establishment politicians and years of economic stagnation, this promise was intoxicating. Yet the cracks in this narrative are becoming harder to ignore. The businessman image works only as long as people believe that business success translates into general prosperity. When Americans look at their own circumstances, wages that have failed to keep up with inflation, health insurance premiums that eat away at household budgets, housing costs that push ownership out of reach, and student debt that lingers for decades, they begin to see that the private sector is not structured to serve their needs. Instead, it serves the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small minority. Trump, far from being separate from that system, is a direct beneficiary of it. His wealth, his connections, his political rise, all of it is tied to the same structures that leave ordinary working people struggling. The realization that Trump's persona as a business genius is more performance than reality is particularly destabilizing for his political standing. For years, critics pointed out that many of his business ventures ended in bankruptcies, lawsuits, or questionable practices. But for his supporters, the symbolic weight of his image often overshadowed the details. He was the man who gets things done, the tough negotiator, the boss who could stare down elites on behalf of the people. That myth was resilient, but myths only last as long as people believe in them. And belief erodes quickly when daily life offers a constant reminder that prosperity remains out of reach, no matter who is in office or what promises are made. When people begin to connect their struggles, not to the failures of Democrats, immigrants, or foreign competitors, but to the larger structure of American capitalism, the Trump persona loses its protective shield. If the problem lies in the system itself, then a man who claims to embody and master that system cannot also be the solution. That contradiction undermines the very foundation of Trump's appeal. His wealth, once admired, comes to symbolize inequality. His brand, once seen as evidence of toughness, begins to look like empty showmanship. His role as a deal maker appears hollow when the deals cut by the wealthy consistently disadvantage workers and communities. The political danger for Trump is that this realization does not need to happen overnight or in dramatic fashion. It unfolds gradually as more Americans compare their economic reality to the promises that were made. They look at their paychecks and realize that the tax cuts did not change their lives, but did enrich corporations and the wealthy. They examine their healthcare costs and recognize that no market solution has provided security. They watch corporations outsource jobs and understand that no businessman president has stopped the trend. In this process, Trump's persona is stripped of its protective glamour. What remains is the figure of a man who benefits from the very inequalities he promised to fix. The power of Trump's persona was always less about reality and more about belief. As that belief wanes, as more people conclude that their struggles are systemic rather than accidental, the persona of the savior businessman becomes not only unbelievable, but offensive. It highlights the distance between the lives of those at the top and the suffering of those below. It reveals that the promise of prosperity through business leadership was never meant to be fulfilled for the majority. And once that truth takes root, the unraveling of Trump's image is not just possible, it is inevitable. The failures of the American economic system are not abstract concepts or academic theories. They are lived realities for tens of millions of people who wake up each day and face mounting bills, stagnant wages, and an uncertain future. For decades, politicians and business leaders have assured the public that the system works, that growth and prosperity are within reach, and that patience and hard work will be rewarded. Yet the evidence surrounding ordinary Americans tells a different story. Wages, when adjusted for inflation, have barely moved for nearly half a century, even as productivity and corporate profits have soared. This means that workers are creating more value than ever before, but that value is being captured not by them, but by the owners of capital, the shareholders, and the executives at the top. The gap between effort and reward is widening, and with it comes frustration, disillusionment, and anger. Nowhere is this disconnect clearer than in the experience of household debt. A generation ago, the promise of upward mobility in America was tied to education, home ownership, and stable employment. Families were told that investing in a college degree would guarantee access to a better life. Yet today, millions of young people carry crushing student debt loads into a job market that offers precarious, low-wage work with few benefits. The dream of home ownership, once marketed as the bedrock of American stability, has slipped out of reach for many, as housing prices rise far faster than incomes. Medical debt, unique to the United States among advanced economies, continues to bankrupt families and deepen inequality. These are not accidents or temporary setbacks. They are the predictable outcomes of an economic model that prioritizes profit extraction over human well-being. At the same time, the cost of living has become an anchor weighing heavily on working and middle-class families. Healthcare premiums, rents, childcare expenses, and the price of basic goods rise year after year, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary people, even when wages appear to increase on paper. Inflation and rising costs quickly swallow any gains. The American worker today finds themselves running faster simply to stay in the same place. They work longer hours, often juggling multiple jobs, yet the sense of security that previous generations took for granted has evaporated. This is not the failure of one administration, nor the result of bad luck. It is the systematic outcome of an economy designed to serve the interests of the few. The political establishment, both Republican and Democrat, has for years reinforced this structure through policy choices. Deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, the weakening of labor protections, and trade agreements favorable to corporations have tilted the playing field against ordinary workers. Each policy taken individually might be explained as reform or modernization, but taken together, they reveal a consistent pattern, the redistribution of wealth upward. The wealthiest Americans have seen their fortunes multiply, while most households cannot cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing. This stark reality makes clear that the economic system is not failing accidentally. It is succeeding in its intended purpose of concentrating wealth and power. In this context, frustration often seeks an outlet. Some politicians have redirected this anger towards scapegoats, immigrants, foreign nations, or cultural changes, rather than toward the structures of the economy itself. Smith's direction has been politically effective, channeling real pain into divisive narratives, yet even these distractions cannot fully obscure the truth. People are starting to recognize that the loss of good-paying jobs is not the result of immigration, but of corporate decisions to outsource labor in pursuit of higher profits. They are beginning to understand that skyrocketing housing prices are not caused by cultural change, but by financial speculation and the concentration of property ownership in the hands of investment firms. The public is slowly piecing together the reality that their struggles share a common root, an economic system organized around profit for a few rather than security for the many. The consequences of this realization are profound. It reshapes how people see their place in society and how they understand political leadership. When the failures of the system become undeniable, politicians who present themselves as managers of that system lose credibility. Promises of reform sound hollow when families see that structural problems are not being addressed. Anger deepens when small concessions are offered while vast fortunes continue to accumulate at the top. And this is where the political danger emerges. When large numbers of Americans shift from blaming one political party or one politician to recognizing the structural nature of their problems, the entire foundation of the existing political order is called into question. This moment of awakening is not just about statistics or economic theory. It is about the lived experience of millions who feel the weight of failure pressing down on their daily lives. It is the mother deciding between rent and medication. It is the student graduating into decades of debt with no guarantee of stable employment. It is the worker who has done everything right, yet finds themselves unable to afford a home, unable to save, unable to retire. These experiences accumulate into a shared recognition that the system is not delivering on its promises. That recognition spreads widely enough, no amount of political branding or personality-driven leadership can mask it. The failures of the system stand in plain sight, demanding acknowledgement, accountability, and ultimately transformation. The political landscape of the United States is undergoing a subtle but profound shift, one that is reshaping the way people understand the roots of their economic struggles. For many years, politicians and media outlets have relied on simple narratives to explain complex problems. Jobs were lost, they said, because immigrants took them. Factories closed, they claimed, because foreign competitors undercut American industry. Communities declined, they argued, because of cultural decay or personal irresponsibility. These stories served an important purpose. They redirected anger away from the system itself and toward convenient scapegoats. Yet as economic pain deepens and spreads across all demographics, more Americans are beginning to realize that these explanations do not match the reality of their lives. They are connecting the dots between their struggles and the decisions made by corporations, financial institutions, and policymakers who prioritize profit above all else. This turning point in voter consciousness is not the result of ideology alone, but of lived experience. A family that once had stable employment at a local factory now finds that the jobs have been moved overseas, not because workers in another country stole them, but because corporations could cut labor costs by exploiting lower wages abroad. A young worker entering the job market discovers that even with a degree, opportunities are limited to part-time or gig work without benefits because businesses have restructured employment to maximize flexibility and minimize obligations to employees. A homeowner watches as a hedge fund buys up houses in their neighborhood, driving up prices and pushing longtime residents out, not because of immigration or cultural change, but because speculative finance treats housing as a commodity rather than a human necessity. These patterns are repeating across the country, and as they do, more people are realizing that their hardships are linked not to outsiders, but to an economic structure that rewards the concentration of wealth and power. The political establishment, both left and right, has long benefited from keeping the public focused on external targets. Trade agreements were sold as modernization, even as they hollowed out entire industries. Immigration debates were framed as threats to wages, even while corporations quietly undermined unions and fought against minimum wage increases. Wars were justified as protecting American jobs and interests abroad, while at home, infrastructure crumbled and social services were slashed. For a time, these narratives held sway because they offered simple answers to difficult questions. But the more that voters compare their daily experiences with the official explanations, the more they recognize a gap between what they are told and what they see with their own eyes. Gap is fueling a deeper understanding of the systemic roots of inequality. This shift in perception is politically dangerous for those who have built their careers on maintaining the status quo. Leaders who frame themselves as defenders of the working class while quietly protecting the interests of corporations and the wealthy risk being exposed when voters conclude that their suffering is not the result of personal failings or foreign competition, but of deliberate economic choices. The recognition that outsourcing, deregulation, tax policies, and union suppression are decisions made by people with power, not natural outcomes of a competitive world, creates a new clarity. It reveals that the economic deck has been stacked and that ordinary citizens were never meant to win under the current rules. When this realization spreads, it also transforms the political energy of the electorate. Anger that was once directed sideways toward neighbors, immigrants, or other communities begins to shift upward toward those who control capital and shape policy. Frustration becomes less about cultural battles and more about economic justice. The narrative of division, so heavily relied upon by politicians to fragment the electorate, begins to weaken as people recognize their shared struggle. The worker in Ohio laid off from a factory has more in common with the gig worker in California or the indebted graduate in New York than with the billionaire who tells them to blame foreigners for their problems. This awakening is fragile but powerful, and it signals the potential for a broad-based movement that transcends partisan lines. The implications are enormous. If voters see their problems as systemic, they demand systemic solutions. Token gestures and symbolic victories are no longer enough to satisfy people who understand that their future depends on rethinking how the economy is structured. They begin to question why healthcare is tied to employment, why education leaves them burdened with debt, why corporations receive tax breaks while public services are underfunded. These questions cut through the partisan theater and get to the core of how wealth and power are distributed. For political leaders who have thrived on managing appearances rather than addressing root causes, this represents a serious challenge. The process of awakening does not occur all at once, nor does it happen evenly across the population. Some will cling to familiar narratives, preferring simple scapegoats over complex truths. But the momentum of lived experience is difficult to suppress. As more families watch their children struggle to find stability, as more communities see their wealth extracted by corporations, and as more workers find themselves with less security despite working harder than ever, the realization deepens. Voters begin to see through the fog of misdirection and recognize that their struggles are not isolated, but connected. This turning point is reshaping the political terrain in ways that cannot easily be undone, and it is laying the groundwork for a more direct confrontation with the economic system itself. Donald Trump has always relied on his ability to project confidence, strength, and control. His political persona is carefully designed to present him as a figure who cannot be shaken, someone who always has the upper hand, whether in business, politics, or media. His supporters have drawn comfort from this image, seeing in him a leader who is never rattled, never defeated, and always capable of turning challenges into victories. Yet the possibility that his own base could begin to question the very system he embodies strikes at the heart of this image. If his followers recognize that their frustrations are not simply the result of political opponents or cultural enemies, but are rooted in the structure of American capitalism itself, the entire foundation of Trump's identity begins to collapse. That collapse would not be quiet or graceful. It would be a visible unraveling, a meltdown, because Trump's political power depends entirely on maintaining the illusion of invulnerability. The core of Trump's appeal has always been the myth of the successful businessman, the man who could bring his supposed mastery of deals and negotiation to the White House. When his base starts to see that this very model of success is part of the problem, the illusion can no longer hold. The businessman is revealed not as the savior of the working class, but as a beneficiary of the very structures that exploit them. For Trump, this is not simply a political problem, it is an existential one. He cannot pivot away from the persona of the businessman because it is the cornerstone of his entire identity. To admit or even appear to acknowledge the failures of the system is to admit his own failure. That contradiction is what makes a meltdown inevitable once the awakening among his supporters grows strong enough. Trump's political instincts in the face of such threats have always been to attack, distract, and redirect. He has perfected the art of turning every critique into an opportunity to demonize opponents, whether they are Democrats, the media, or foreign governments. But when the critique shifts away from external enemies and toward the system itself, those tactics lose their potency. How can he redirect anger away from capitalism when his entire persona is built on being its champion? How can he convince supporters to trust his leadership when they begin to see that the rules he played by are the very ones that keep them struggling? The usual weapons in his arsenal, rallies filled with fiery rhetoric, social media outbursts, and personal attacks, cannot stop the deeper recognition that the suffering of his followers is systemic. In such a scenario, Trump's behavior is likely to intensify in ways that make the unraveling even more visible. Unable to tolerate challenges to his image, he will lash out more unpredictably, creating spectacles that may temporarily distract but ultimately confirm his vulnerability. His reliance on constant self-promotion and image management means that any crack in the facade becomes magnified. If his followers begin to question whether his wealth and power are symbols of corruption rather than competence, the feedback loop of his politics, where adoration reinforces his persona and his persona fuels more adoration, breaks down. That is why the prospect of his supporters awakening to systemic truths represents a unique kind of threat. It is not merely about losing votes. It is about losing the very foundation of his identity. This unraveling is not only personal, but symbolic of a larger shift. Trump's meltdown in the face of systemic critique would demonstrate how fragile political figures become when their power rests on myths rather than on concrete solutions. He has survived scandals, investigations, and controversies by keeping the focus on personalities rather than policies. But when the debate turns to structural realities, when people demand answers about wages, healthcare, housing, and debt, his bravado cannot provide the solutions. The gap between rhetoric and reality grows too wide to ignore. His supporters may still feel loyalty, but loyalty built on unmet promises and worsening conditions eventually erodes. The spectacle of Trump under pressure also reveals something about the broader political culture. For years, American politics has elevated personalities over systems, treating leaders as saviors or villains while avoiding the harder questions about how the economy functions. Trump is the most extreme example of this trend, turning politics into a theater of self-branding. His rise and potential meltdown are therefore not only about him, but about the limits of personality-driven politics in a moment of systemic crisis. When voters begin demanding systemic answers, the politics of branding, bluster, and personal image cannot withstand the weight of reality. For Trump, who thrives on dominance and control, the loss of that aura is devastating. His entire political strategy depends on convincing supporters that he is the only one who can fix the nation's problems. If those same supporters conclude that the problems are bigger than him, rooted in a system that he cannot or will not change, then the persona of invincibility disintegrates. What remains is a man exposed as part of the problem, not the solution. That exposure is intolerable for someone who has built his life on the performance of strength. The meltdown, then, is not only predictable but unavoidable once the illusion begins to fail. The unraveling of Donald Trump's image, dramatic as it may be, is not the central story that matters most in the current political and economic climate. What truly matters is the broader awakening that his downfall would symbolize, an awakening that moves beyond the fixation on one man and toward a deeper recognition of systemic realities. For years, American politics has revolved around personalities, leaders cast as heroes or villains, saviors or threats. This has been especially true with Trump, whose larger-than-life persona has dominated media cycles and political debates for nearly a decade. Yet, when the public begins to understand that their struggles cannot be explained by the rise or fall of one figure, no matter how polarizing, the political conversation shifts fundamentally. It becomes about structures, systems, and the possibilities of transformation. Trump's collapse as a symbol of capitalist success would not simply mark the decline of one politician, it would signal the weakening of an entire ideology. The belief that businessmen, billionaires, and corporate leaders are uniquely qualified to solve the problems of ordinary Americans has been a persistent theme in U.S. politics. It is an ideology that equates wealth with wisdom and personal fortune with public service. Trump embodied this myth more openly than anyone, declaring that his riches proved his competence and that his experience in business made him the ideal steward of the nation. When that myth falls apart, it invites the public to question not only Trump, but the entire premise that the wealthy elite are natural leaders. It pushes people to ask why, if business leaders are so competent, the economy consistently fails to provide stability and fairness for the majority. The collapse of this narrative opens political space for a new kind of conversation. Instead of debating which individual is best suited to manage the system, people begin to ask whether the system itself should remain as it is. This is a far more radical question, and it is one that mainstream politics has long tried to avoid. For decades, both major parties have operated on the assumption that capitalism, left largely intact, is beyond debate. Disagreements centered on how to manage it, how to regulate its worst abuses, or how to distribute its benefits. But as the failures mount, stagnant wages, soaring debt, unaffordable housing, insecure work, those assumptions are harder to sustain if the fall of Trump helps spark a wider recognition that the system itself is the problem. Then the focus of politics necessarily shifts from personalities to structures. This shift would also have cultural consequences. American media and political discourse thrive on spectacle, on personal drama, on framing politics as a clash between individuals. Trump has been the perfect subject for this approach, feeding the cycle with his constant need for attention and controversy. But when the public grows less interested in the theatrics of personality and more focused on the concrete realities of policy, the media itself is forced to change. The coverage of political battles becomes less about who won the latest insult exchange and more about what is being done to address systemic issues. This transition will not happen overnight, but it is already visible in the growing appetite for discussions about inequality, healthcare reform, housing policy, and the climate crisis. The spectacle of Trump can only distract for so long before lived reality demands more substantive engagement. Most importantly, moving beyond one man creates the possibility of collective empowerment. Struggles are framed as battles between individuals. Trump versus Biden, Republicans versus Democrats. The public is relegated to the role of spectators, choosing sides in a contest they do not control. But when people recognize that their shared problems stem from systemic design, they begin to see themselves not as spectators, but as participants with the power to demand change. The conversation shifts from who will save us to how can we together transform this system. That shift in consciousness is more powerful than any election cycle or personality-driven drama. It is the foundation for movements that can reshape society in lasting ways. Trump's meltdown in this sense is less a political event than a catalyst for a broader realization. The focus should not linger on the spectacle of his downfall, but on the opportunities it creates. His exposure as a symbol of systemic failure clears the way for a deeper critique of capitalism and a search for alternatives. It invites people to imagine an economy organized not around enriching the few, but around meeting the needs of the many. It makes space for serious discussion about worker power, public investment, universal services, and democratic control of resources. These are ideas that have long been marginalized in mainstream debate, but as the failures of the system become undeniable, they move from the edges into the center. The significance of Trump's unraveling, then, is not in the spectacle itself, but in what follows. It is about the public recognizing that their frustrations are not unique, not caused by personal failings or partisan enemies, but shared and systemic. It is about building the collective understanding that change will not come from the rise or fall of one man, but from the organized action of people demanding a new economic and political order. Trump may melt down under the weight of that recognition, but the real story lies in the awakening of the millions who will no longer settle for illusions, no longer place their hopes in personalities, and no longer accept the system that fails them so profoundly. So I close with this. Our task is not merely to watch the spectacle of one man's unraveling. Our task is to deepen this awakening, to push beyond personalities and towards systemic change. If Mr. Trump melts down, let it be because the people of this country are rising up to demand an economy that serves the many, not the few. That is the moment when the real history begins, not with the collapse of one man, but with the rebirth of a movement for economic democracy. Thank you.